New audit of the November election won by President Donald Trump in Wisconsin found no evidence any votes were counted incorrectly. Furthermore, the audit did not find any evidence of voting machines or software being hacked or otherwise tampered with. The Wisconsin Elections Commission released the findings last week. They're scheduled to discuss them this Friday. Trump defeated former Vice President Kamala Harris in Wisconsin by just over 29,000 votes.